Hi, I'm Bob Herbert. Welcome to OpEd.tv. We've made some modest inroads against poverty in the past year or two, but it's still a very big problem in the U.S. Nearly 47 million Americans are poor. More than a third of all black children are poor. In New York City, nearly 60,000 people, many of them children, are crammed into the homeless shelters each night. We'll talk about this, what's working, what's not, and what needs to be done with one of the keenest observers of poverty in the country, Greg Kaufmann. He's a senior fellow at the Center for American Progress and the editor-in-chief of a wonderful website, talkpoverty.org. Greg, welcome.
It's a pleasure to be with you, Bob.
You argued in a recent piece that the way we tend to think about poverty in this country is incorrect. It's wrong. Talk a little bit about what you meant by that.
Yeah. I think the myths and stereotypes about poverty have been with us for so long now. I think that people, for one thing, think of people in poverty as a fixed group of people that's, poor year in, year out. The fact is, it's a very small proportion of people in poverty who will be poor every year. If you look at a period over 3 years, like Dr. Mark Rank did at the Washington University in St. Louis, during a time when we had 15 to 16% poverty, only 3.5% of people were poor for all 36 months. In contrast, we know that during our working years, 40% of us, just about 40% of us, will spend at least 1 year in poverty. More than half of us will be in poverty or just above poverty. So, I think the first thing people have to think about when we think about what we get wrong is who is poor and how we fall into poverty.
So that's a good point right there. Who is poor? The people who fall, below the official level of what the poverty rate is. You're right, a lot of them are the subject of these stereotypes, and the stereotypes are pretty widely held. But who is poor?
I think when people think about people in poverty, often the stereotype is urban and
Yep.
people of color. And it's true that a disproportionate number of people in poverty are African American, Latino, Native American. But of course, there are more white people in poverty than any other racial group. And so that's important to keep in mind. At the same time, we do want to be, aware that disinvestment in communities, and particularly where people of color live, has been going on for generations now.
The stereotype is that people are poor. First and foremost, it's their own fault that they're poor.
Right.
They're poor because they're lazy.
Right.
They're either not working or they're not working hard enough. Essentially, they don't really want to work, and then whatever other stereotypes are out there. You've been looking at this issue pretty closely for a while now. To what extent do those stereotypes sort of accord with what you've been seeing?
Well, one thing that really infuriates me about that stereotype in particular, about people being lazy, or conservatives would say things in recent years like the safety net's a hammock.
Right.
People need to better understand in this country, first of all, what the safety net is. When you talk about the SNAP program, which people know as food stamps, the average benefit is $1.40 per person per meal. How are people laying back and living on that? They have an image of somebody getting kind of all forms of assistance: food, cash, housing. We know that 1 in 4 families who qualify for federal rental assistance actually receive it. So most people aren't getting that.
Most people who are qualified for it don't get it.
Yeah, childcare assistance, federal childcare assistance, 1 in 6 who qualify. And then you look at cash assistance in this country, TANF, it's virtually non-existent now since welfare reform in 1996. And finally, I'd say the other thing people need to think a lot more about, because the problem of poverty is so much about jobs and wages, right? So the minimum wage today, $7.25 an hour, is a poverty wage, literally. And by that I mean, in the late 1960s, the minimum wage could lift a family of 3 above the poverty line. Now that same family, that same worker working full time, who's more productive and on average more educated, is going to be more than $4,000 below the poverty line of about $19,000 for a family of three. Let's talk about jobs too. The unemployment rate since the March on Washington for African Americans has
1963.
has been twice the rate of white unemployment rate. So
that's consistent. That's in good times and bad. The unemployment rate for African Americans twice what it is for whites.
And so during at least the beginning of the recession, the Great Recession, when the media was talking about a recession, and from your own work, we were looking at more like a depression for African American people. So there's plenty of educating that needs to happen when it comes to the safety net and our economy and how it relates to poverty.
You wrote a piece for The Nation magazine last year that carried the headline, "Poor people need a higher wage, not a lesson in morality."
Yeah.
Tell us about that piece and what prompted it.
So David Brooks wrote a column, your old colleague at the Times. He kind of picked three sort of extreme examples of families struggling in poverty, and I don't doubt that those extreme examples are true, but this is what the media tends to do. They pick out sort of an outlier and try to say this is what poverty is like. Anyway, he used their struggles to make an argument that what we need is a moral revolution. And he said, he suggested questions that people need to ask themselves, such as, am I, and I'm paraphrasing, but one that really stuck with me is, am I seeking immediate gratification or am I planning for the future?
Right.
And it just made me so angry. And Bob, and part of that anger, it's not just an intellectual anger, and from your work, you get to know people in poverty, and you get to know families and individuals and their struggles, and so you hear something like that, and you get mad. And so I wrote this piece and sort of pointed out that this myth about people in poverty has been with us forever. I referenced Michael Catt's The Undeserving Poor, which people should read, but anyway, I said, yeah, Mr. Brooks is right. We need a moral revolution. But the revolution we need is for policymakers to think about the choices they're making in terms of our policy. So look in the mirror and say, am I accepting that someone who works full-time stays in poverty?
Right.
Am I accepting that our schools are separate and unequal, with some having state-of-the-art facilities and poorer schools sharing textbooks, leaking facilities, etc.? Am I accepting that I get to go to work, or I get to take a paid sick day from work, but somebody in poverty misses a paycheck to try to take care of their kids? You can go on and on and on with the policy choices we make as a country and really flip that narrative about, who's really being immoral here.
Right. If we had this moral/political revolution in this country, and suddenly we woke up and the government and then the rest of us, private citizens, really wanted to do something serious about poverty, essentially wipe it out, which is what Lyndon Johnson said he wanted to do. What are the things we would need to be doing?
Well, you know what? I'm glad you referenced LBJ because, first of all, we need to know what we're doing right. So conservatives in particular are always maligning the safety net. We need to realize that poverty would be twice as high today, nearly 30% poverty in America without the safety net.
That's across the board.
That's across the board. So rather than saying we lost a war on poverty, we need to say we're halfway to where we ultimately want to be. And I think some of the next steps we need to take are pretty obvious. Again, we need a minimum wage that isn't a poverty wage, so that when you're working, you can feed your families and house your families and get out of poverty.
I don't understand. That seems like such an obvious issue to me.
Yeah.
Someone who works full-time at a real job should not fall below the poverty line. That just seems fundamental to me.
It seems like regular Americans across party lines maybe mostly support that. I don't know the actual polling.
Actually, that's true, but there is overwhelming support for an increase in the minimum wage.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. So, yeah, I agree with you completely that the fact that we can't rally around that is absurd. And I would say about everything we're about to talk about, what we need to do, a key to getting that done are movements and connecting with the grassroots. So all the action we've seen of late around raising the minimum wage in states and cities are because of Fight for 15 and organizing. Same with paid sick leave, changing the conversation around immigration reform. But to get back to your question, what we would do, the starting points for me are minimum wage, paid family and sick leave, and affordable childcare. It's tough to go to work when you can't have a safe place for your kids. And I read a statistic the other day that's really stayed with me. If you have 2 young kids and you're paying for them to be in childcare at a center, it's going to cost more than a year of tuition at a public university, which is insane. Richard Nixon had a proposal during his presidency for universal childcare.
Nixon would be viewed as a liberal.
He wouldn't stand a chance in the primary. So we need to look at those kinds of policies. I'd say we need a serious jobs program for marginalized communities. We need to rebuild the abandoned housing, schools, infrastructure. We need to look at immigration reform because these are some of the most 11 million undocumented workers, people. And
many of them exploited in the workplace.
Well, that's what I was going to say, our most vulnerable workers. We need to look at our cash assistance, income assistance program. As I said before, temporary assistance to needy families, welfare reform is virtually dead in this country. And, there's been talk in this campaign, Secretary Clinton, I don't believe I've heard anything from Donald Trump about a child tax credit for people who have young children. That would make a tremendous difference. We have research evidence that shows when low-income families receive a modest boost in their income, we're talking like $3,000, the outcomes for the kids in terms of education and earnings are great as adults. And by the way, when conservatives say we don't have evidence, that's not true. These programs have been around. We've been able to track people. We just don't have the evidence they want to disprove that things
Exactly.
work.
The results of the programs have been studied.
That's right.
You're right. The evidence is there.
Yep.
You mentioned TANF, cash assistance, welfare. So back in the 1990s, Bill Clinton and at the behest of the Republicans, but following essentially a Republican program, changed welfare. They were going to change welfare as we knew it. That was the phrase at the time. Mm-hmm. And this, of course, was under the umbrella idea of this was going to be better for the recipients, better for the poor, better for everyone. Tell us what happened and how it's worked out.
Right. So in 1996, for every 100 families with children in poverty, 68 received cash assistance. Not great, but okay. Today, that number's down to 23.
Out of 100.
Out of every 100 families with kids in poverty. In a dozen states, it's 10 or fewer families out of 100. Yeah, it's obscene. And on top of that, Bob, you're looking at when people do get benefits, none of the benefits take people over 50% of the poverty line. So you're still in deep poverty. So 50% of the poverty line, you're talking about $9,000 annually for a family of 3. None of the states reach above that, nor does the District of Columbia. And what's really important about understanding this, I think, for the American people, is that TANF, welfare reform, is held up as the model by conservatives for what they'd like to do with the rest of the safety net, the stuff that's working. And so what they're talking about is a block grant. TANF was a block grant in 1996. Right. It wasn't indexed, so it's lost 20% of its value. Less people get help. So when they talk about block granting Medicaid, block granting SNAP, food stamps, block granting housing, Speaker Ryan's proposed that. What you're talking about is, one, getting rid of national standards for what sort of economic decency represents. 2, you're talking about less people getting housing, less people getting food, and less people getting the health care they need. All of this is going to make poverty not only worse, but it's going to cost our country more in the long run.
I was just going to say, all of this is a drag on the overall economy.
That's right. That's right. And there was a remarkable study originally done by Harry Holzer some years ago that showed the cost of child poverty annually to the United States was $550 billion a year. Nobody took issue with this number. You didn't hear people say, "Oh, well, he's figuring it out wrong." It was about 3% of GDP. A colleague of mine at the Center for American Progress, Rachel West, recently updated that. She's an economist, came over from UC Berkeley to work with us, and put the number at about $670 billion a year. And if you think about it, you're talking about costs associated with lost productivity, criminal justice, healthcare, because when you're poor, you're dealing with a lot of health stressors, to say the least. So, bad policy when it comes to poverty isn't just bad for people in poverty, it's bad for the country economically.
Right. Now, you contend that we're making some headway in terms of movements, anti-poverty movements in this country. Talk about that a little bit.
Well, look, we had the largest reduction in poverty last year in nearly 50 years. It was more than 3 million people. I believe 3.5 million fewer people in poverty last year compared to the year before. And the reason for that, in no small part, was due to the minimum wage movement, people increasing minimum wage. So more people, everybody had gains across the board, and actually low-income people had the largest gains. And that was in large part due to minimum wage and health insurance. I mean, we have the highest rate of people insured by health. It might be stated as we have the lowest rate of uninsurance. I don't know how they figure, same thing. But so people are healthier. And that too, I mean, the Affordable Care Act didn't happen in a vacuum. You remember, there was a lot of grassroots activity around that. So when I look at the Fight for 15, and I look at the Dreamers, and I look at the Moral Mondays, Black Lives Matter, which is an anti-poverty movement in a lot of ways. I think the more we bring these movements together, I think Reverend Barber talks about fusion politics, and I'm not sure if I'm using it correctly. But
he's in North Carolina,
who
the
founded the Moral Mondays movement, that we have all of these people taking action on economic justice, and the more we come together, the more we're going to pressure people in Washington to take action.
What would be needed to get more people involved? Because it seems to me that a lot of this stuff is we're not going to get it initiated at the government level, that it's not going to be sort of a top-down kind of movement if a movement is developed.
I should say, Bob, when I left journalism, at least journalism full-time, I wanted to be an advocate and an activist. And generally people weren't interested. They said keep writing and keep editing, which is what I'm doing at Talk Poverty. But I would say that, relatedly, I think part of what we need to do is lift up the voices of people in poverty, because people have been shut out of the media, knocked down for so long. There's so much stigma associated with poverty. And people I've talked to who are living in poverty say that has stopped them in the past from being more politically active, because there's a shame around poverty. If you talk to, for example, the women in the group Witnesses to Hunger, this is mostly women, also men in poverty. It started in Philly. It's in about, 10 cities around the country now. They use photography and their testimonials to document poverty, and then they advocate at the state, local, and federal level for change. Anyway, in getting to know some of them over the years, what's also developed through that program, that project, is a community where they can begin to share their experiences, overcome their stigma. So I think that part of what we need, ultimately an anti-poverty movement is going to be led by working class people, is to do our part to lift up those voices, tell those stories. But I also think the next president could, let's not call it a poverty tour, let's call it going to communities regularly to understand what they're going through.
As opposed to just ignoring folks who are struggling.
Until the campaigns roll around. All of that would help, I think, to solidify political action around anti-poverty policy.
Why do you think since there are large numbers of people who are either officially poor or who are just a notch or two above the official poverty line, who are struggling economically, why do you think there's such a lack of interest in this country? The press, the media writ large, won't cover it in any kind of a sustained way.
Right.
I assume politicians don't talk about it.
Right.
I assume that's because they think the public is not interested or there's no benefit in talking about it. Why this lack of interest?
Right. Well, so first the media question, and I would actually be really interested in your take. Before I was ever a reporter, you were one of, and I was just someone interested in poverty, you were one of the few people I could count on, and it's nice to thank you in person for that, for staying on it. I think, I had heard that generally as the business of media changed, that editors didn't think that their clients were interested in poverty, but that doesn't hold true when you look at, I'm told, when you look at traffic. But I also think a big part of it, Bob, is if you want to do good poverty reporting as a journalist, as you have to develop your stories. It's your beat. You have to develop your relationships, and the news isn't investing in that kind of way. I think in journalism, and certainly not poverty journalism. I think that's part of it. But I really would actually be interested in what you think about this as well.
I think that there's a misconception about the level of the lack of interest among the public at large. I think that if you made the stories interesting, and there are a lot of interesting stories out there, go after the ones that are interesting. I think people would pay attention, and then if the people start to pay attention, the politicians would start to pay attention. But I also think that there's a racial component there. That your big media outlets, the big mainstream organizations, they're not that interested in stories that they see either primarily involving racial or ethnic minorities, or that they think would be primarily of interest to racial or ethnic minorities. So I think that that's a factor.
I think that racial component is really important. And I was actually thinking about, on my way to come talk to you, I was thinking about the news in DC, and I live in Chevy Chase in Washington DC. Right. It's affluent neighborhood, and if something happens in my neighborhood, if there's first of all, if there's a robbery, you will see a police presence. If there, a few years ago there was a murder nearby, there was a media circus about this because it doesn't happen. Meanwhile, in DC, in community African American neighborhoods, day in, day out, people are going through these challenges and more, and it's almost like they're just like, well, that's an old story.
I couldn't agree more, and I wish we had more time to talk about these issues that go so fast. Greg Kaufmann, thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
All right. We'll be back in a moment with a final word. I was running the night desk at the Daily News 32 years ago when we got a report that an emotionally disturbed woman had been shot by a police officer. That woman was Eleanor Bumpers. She was in her late 60s and, indeed, emotionally disturbed. She had screamed angrily through the locked door of her Bronx apartment at marshals who had come to evict her for non-payment of her $98 a month rent. And she reached for a large kitchen knife when the police later bashed in the door and stormed into her apartment. There was no one else on the premises. Ms. Bumpers lived alone. The team of heavily armed officers could have and should have isolated and contained Ms. Bumpers for however long it took to resolve the situation without the loss of life. Instead, one of the officers, Stephen Sullivan, raised his 12-gauge single-barreled shotgun and fired twice. One of the blasts tore through Ms. Bumpers' chest, killing her for the crime of being disturbed. Fast forward to October 18th of this year. The police were summoned by neighbors to the Bronx apartment of Deborah Danner, a 66-year-old woman who was emotionally disturbed. Like Eleanor Bumpurs, she was agitated and acting erratically. Like Ms. Bumpurs, she lived alone. As in the Bumpurs case, the police did not isolate and contain Ms. Danner until the situation could be resolved without loss of life. Ms. Danner was reported to have been waving a pair of scissors and then came at one of the officers, Sergeant Hugh Barry, with a baseball bat. Sergeant Barry raised his service weapon and fired twice, killing Ms. Danner for the crime of being disturbed. I was in the Army many years ago, and my buddies and I were trained in the use of deadly weapons. We would have laughed at the idea that we'd have to kill an elderly woman armed with a knife or a baseball bat in order to subdue her. That would have struck us as just the most ridiculous thing. Some police officers obviously have a different mindset. That's all for now. See you next time.